Welcome to Inside Out Conversations, the show where women, and particularly Black women, talk about the things we normally don't talk about and only think about. This is Lisa Lackey, your conversation starter. Hello and welcome to the podcast. Today we are celebrating women who tell our stories, going right along with the theme of Women's Month. Women's Month is March of every year. I want to introduce you to a longtime sister friend. She's my guest today, and her name is Reverend Dr. Irene Taylor. She's joining me today for a conversation about the women and their stories that have impacted our lives. Irene is a retired pastor and has been serving for almost 40 years, and now she's retired. She is also a retired chaplain of the United States Army Reserve, and most importantly, she has impacted many women throughout her life. And I am definitely one of those women. And so I'm just glad to celebrate her this Women's Month. And I hope that you will enjoy and hear some of the wisdom that Irene has to share with us today. Thank you. I am here with my long-term friend and sister, Reverend Irene Taylor. And every March I get excited because it's Women's Month. And it is so special to me and has been probably for the last 20 years because it's just this opportunity for us to celebrate ourselves and also to celebrate and reflect on those women that have impacted our lives and impacted our lives in all kinds of ways. And so when I learned that this year's theme for Women's Month was celebrating the women who tell our stories. And kind of my first response was that, well, I want to tell my own story. I don't need anybody to tell my story. And then I thought about it and I thought about a lot of things. One thing I thought about was how if you go to 12-step meetings and one of the really critical pieces of healing and recovering is people share their stories. Now it's their story, but often when you're listening, you hear parts of your story that you hadn't connected yet. And so the power of story is so rich and deep, and it allows us to connect in a way that we can experience empathy and compassion and an intimate level of connection. And on the other side of the story, the person telling the story gets to have a witness to their story. And, so often when parts of our stories took place, there was no witness, or there may have been, but we didn't feel comfortable sharing our stories, or the person that we shared the story with was not able to be present with us to be a fair witness of that story. So when I think about women who tell our story, one of the first people that come to mind for me is Reverend Irene Taylor. And I have to say that I don't remember, I guess I was in my early 20s. And I was just exploring my life spiritually. And I was in between places in terms of what I thought, what I didn't think, what I believed, what I didn't believe. But I walked into a Wednesday evening. It wasn't even a Bible study. It was a group of women that were gathered in the kitchen of this church, and they were just sharing and laughing and having fun, and it was all different ages of women. And that just seemed so different to me because I had this picture of, how women would act in a kind of spiritual or church or Christian kind of environment. And so it was fun. And we were talking about all kinds of things that were really life things. And I remember I enjoyed it so much that I went the next time. And Reverend Irene would always close the time with some sort of reflection or a prayer or, just kind of comforting words. But she would also invite someone from the circle to do the same. And so this particular night, even when I think about it now, my heart is beating out of my chest. I was kind of like trying to give her first the stare down so she would know, like, do not ask me. And then I was turning my head so maybe she wouldn't notice me. And I'm sure that it wasn't, any of these things that she was noticing. It was just kind of hyper. I had this hyper awareness. And she asked me to pray. I was like, oh my God, I don't know how to pray out loud. And I certainly don't sound like these other women that I've heard pray. And you know what? I'm doing probably a lot of stuff in my life that these women aren't doing, at least not currently. But I prayed. And that relationship has continued to this day in all different kinds of ways. And that experience and those experiences through those years have impacted me. What you taught me is one that I could be authentic in my faith, that I didn't have to be somebody else. I didn't have to have it all together, and I didn't have to pretend that I did. And the second thing is you taught me that, just because you're developing as a young woman spiritually doesn't mean that you can't have fun, doesn't mean that you can't laugh, doesn't mean like your whole life is over and you have to wear a dress down to your knees and, not fix up. Like it didn't, those were like pictures that I had in mind. The other thing is you gave me such a love and desire to understand not just the Bible, but African American philosophers, theologians, all kinds of historical and contemporary readings, and how to apply those things to my life in a way that it made sense for the way that we were living in the present time. And so I just want you to know that. And it's so much love and desire for study that years later, I went to seminary, not to become a pastor. I went to seminary to just expand my understanding and to make those connections to daily life. And later on, began to be an assistant pastor at a church. But the thing I loved most was teaching and application and leaving people room to grow or not grow at their own pace. So that's a long thing, but you were one of those women that told my story because you shared so much of yourself.
Wow. Thank you. I am humbled by that. When I think about our stories, I'm one of those women that were really blessed to be nurtured by women all my life. The woman that impacted me the most was my great aunt. Because my mother was going through a difficult time and had so many children, and she's part of the story because she had to make a tough decision about letting me go during a very difficult time in her life because I was sick and we didn't have the resources or anything. She walked out of an abusive relationship as a bold and courageous lady. But there I was, a sick child. And so I got to go live with a great aunt. This woman taught me what it means to be bold and courageous. If they saw me walking home from school with my head down, the question would be, are you feeling okay? And I would go, yes. Well, then why are you walking with your head down? Put your head up and walk with your head up. She couldn't read. But one of the most amazing things about our ancestors is that they knew scripture. And so my aunt was able to teach me scripture, but she couldn't read. My aunt taught me how to dress. I may have been 8 years old, but a woman wears gloves and a hat and shoes have to match, but extremely, she taught me what it means to be feminine. And we may not embrace that statement so much, but maybe it was more than that. How to be a person of dignity. She insisted that I go to church, that I participate in everything at church. They didn't believe in baptizing children, but my aunt was so good at making me bold and courageous. At 7 years old, I could tell the pastor, I need to be baptized.
Hmm.
So I think my aunt was the foundation.
Yeah. It's even more than dignity. Like to me, when I think about it, she taught you how to be confident and
Yes.
sure of who you were and that
Yes.
you belong there. And I have to
Yes.
say that it has worked well even through all these years. Because I don't know that you ever step into a place where you don't walk in like, I'm supposed to be here.
Yes, that's the gift that both my aunt and uncle gave to me, but especially Ethel Sinclair. So this woman, this great aunt of mine, introduced me to people that would step into my life and help shape and form my identity as a young African American girl. And so not only did she do it, but the other person from that small community that influenced my life was a woman named Wadey Helen Buys. She was a high school teacher, African American woman. And in those days, you had lawyers, doctors, rich, poor, all blacks lived in the same community because it was a segregated community. And during those days, we had our own stores, our own doctors, dentists, dry cleaners, everything was right in our community. And so it was a fairly well educated community to be so small and in those days, too. But Miss Bice was a high school teacher, and because my aunt and uncle could not read or write, she would sometimes try to help me with my homework and all the things that I used to do. But she was like the first professional woman I got to know. And she was also raising her niece, but her niece was considerably younger than I was. And she had the same values. I would venture to say all the women in the community had sort of the same values, all the people. But one of the things about Miss Byes is that she would not carry a briefcase. And I used to say to her, why don't you carry a briefcase? And so she would say to me, it's because I want to identify with the women of the community. And most of the women of the community cleaned house or did ironing and stuff. And they carried shopping bags, like, all their stuff. And so she said, when I come home from work, I want to identify with the people that I live with. And so she never carried a briefcase. She would always carry that shopping bag as well. But she taught me the importance of education. Actually, it was she, and I'm focusing on the early development because I think early development is critical to who we become. In addition to her, there was my third grade teacher, Mrs. Manfield, who was, when I think about her now, I sort of chuckle and laugh because she was a little different. She was a classical singer, and during the summer months, she would travel all over the country and the world doing classical music. But she taught the third grade. And all of them insisted that we learn how to represent our community. We used to have to go to Mrs. Manfield's house on Saturdays and listen to classical music, and she would teach us you had to dress proper. You couldn't go unless you were dressed proper. So you couldn't wear your play clothes. You had to get dressed up, and you had to learn how to drink tea and the little fancy cookies. I don't even know the names of them anymore. But they began to teach me something about womanhood and sisterhood, all of them, because I saw these strong Black women who were living in some very difficult times come together through their faith and through their various experiences and build community. And that community was not void of the role of mentoring. We call it mentoring now. I don't think it was called mentoring back then, but mentoring young girls to become all that they could be. Yeah, we fussed because we didn't want to do the charm classes. We didn't want to do all of that kind of stuff. But when we would go and gather at their homes, there was always something deeper that transpired that taught us, I think, the value of sisterhood, of coming together, getting away from the men to deal with issues that related to us, and learning to value ourselves as important people apart from feeling like you had to always have a man doing things for you. There are some things you can do for yourself. And the importance of community. I think that's the other value that I got from them. Faith and community were the two strongest things, and community work together. I am reminded of a number of times when things would go wrong in the community. We never saw any police officers, and we didn't see police officers, I now realize, in our community because we didn't have any, and the white police officers would not come into the community. And so that meant we had to learn how to take care of ourselves, you know. The first awareness of sort of something was different about our community was when one of my uncle's renter homes burned down to the ground. And I was just a kid standing on the front porch watching this and wondering why the fire department wouldn't come when they were just across the street. And they stood watching the house burn down. And it didn't click to me until years. I was an adult person, some of what was going on, because the community, in a strange way, shielded us from that pain. They wanted to make sure we didn't get scarred by those kinds of things. And so going to a restaurant to eat, my uncle used to take me, I know this is about women, but my uncle used to take me to the Greyhound bus station because I loved their ham and cheese sandwiches and everything. And so I never understood why we had to go sit in the back. And he would just tell me things like, well, they have the best food in the back, so you don't want to sit out here. And years later, I learned that. But going back to the story of the women, they never let our being poor, our not having the same things be a factor in our becoming all that we could be. You know, we were at church one Sunday when I was ordained, and I think this story has become part of my journey. My aunt, even when she passed, I was only 12 years old. I always felt like her spirit, that sisterhood thing that we talk about, stayed with me and she watched over me. So on the Sunday when I preached my trial sermon, there was a woman who came into church and she sat on the same pew with you and Steve. And my aunt would always tell me, if you get nervous, just look at me. And she, when I would look at her, she would have just this confidence in my ability and what I was doing. And then I would step into that confidence because she knew it was there. And so that Sunday, I'm standing there and there's this woman and she's smiling. And I don't know her. I've never seen her before, but I knew her spirit. And I kept trying to figure out. So after the service, I said to you and Steve, who was the woman sitting on the pew next to you all? And you said, I didn't see anyone sitting next to me. You said, let me ask Steve. So you asked Steve, and Steve said, nobody was sitting next to us. And it just finally clicked. I was familiar with the spirit. I knew the person. My aunt showed up because she was my number one supporter. She would always tell me, you can do anything you set your mind to. If you get scared, just look at me and I will give you the confidence. She would say, when you speak, speak out loud and clear, be bold, don't be intimidated. And when the service was over, she disappeared. So I was asking you where she was at. That's the kind of person this woman was, you know, just awesome in my life. And so she taught me, and the women in that small community taught me the importance of sisterhood before I knew the term sisterhood. And so by the time I was at Second Baptist, I think I had to learn how to tear down some walls to be that woman, that gift that they poured into me, how to walk in it and live it. So I went all kinds of ways. I didn't think I was, you know, I was one of the first Blacks to go to an all white school in my hometown after I returned to live with my parents after my aunt passed. And I can remember being in this all white school and how I was broken, just really broken because it was nothing like the community of love that I grew up in. You know, everybody was for themselves, and there was just, I felt lost. And there was one incident where some young white girls just did this awful thing to me in the auditorium. I thought for the first time they were going to sit on the same row with me, but they were all laughing and talking. So when they got near me, one of them looked up and she saw me and she just let out this scream, and all of them screamed and they turned and walked away. And I felt so humiliated. I think it's Maslow who talks about the levels of identity that we are. And on that day, I just disappeared. I was gone, and I didn't know how I was going to make it.
So stop right there because when I think about the theme, women who tell our stories, you know, being outside of community and sistership and fellowship and family, whether we were related by blood or not to these women, so often our experience was becoming invisible. And it was such a contradiction to what these women were showing us and telling us in our families and in our communities. And something just got lost because if you think about how many years ago that was, and you're talking about it today, and when you said it, I just felt something just split right through my chest because I identify with that. It's where all you have all this extended family, and then you step out into the world outside of that protective world. And all of a sudden, it makes you question everything that you knew emphatically. And to think about those women like your great aunt and teachers and neighbors and your mom, to think about they went through that too. And somehow they were able to step back into themselves to give us something because they knew looking out that you're going to experience this. You're going to experience where your story is not going to be cared about, where you're going to have these experiences where your story is erased, where you doubt your story, where you start to fit into other stories that are not yours. And so that is such a pivotal moment. And I guess the thing that's noteworthy for me is that that's still happening. I spend a lot of time working with women in general that are, high functioning, high achieving, high profile. And they're also usually the only ones. And then in much more particular ways, I do that work with Black women who are even more isolated. Like they may have broke that glass ceiling, climbed that ladder, and there's nobody there. There's nobody there to support them. And we've become further and further apart because of, accessibility and busyness and this and that and the other, that even in churches and even in sororities and even in, other kinds of clubs, women aren't connecting at the same level. So we don't even know that we share the same story.
Yeah. Yeah. And that is, it's so amazing to me because what it does, it has the ability to cause you to want to isolate yourself. It brings about shame. And first of all, if you've been taught all your life that you are somebody, I knew that before Reverend Jesse Jackson came along with it, because my aunt and all of them taught me. And so my walking with my head in the air was part of the cultural thing that I was supposed to embrace. So when that event happened, I wasn't prepared for it because the Black community tended to be a very loving, nurturing, and caring community. Suddenly, I walked out of that familiar space into a strange land where I was not wanted or invited. And so that behavior was foreign to me. I had never experienced that kind of rejection before. More than that, I think rejection, I don't know if you can separate rejection and hurt, but I was wounded on that day. I did not think I could get up. And then what kicked in was this thing called shame, because I didn't want to go home and tell my parents what happened to me at school. First of all, because they were not supportive of my going to this all white school. They wanted me to continue to go to the Black school. And I had a sense they would say, well, we tried to warn you. You knew that was going to come. But I think it's a much deeper level. When someone wounds you, it brings about shame. You just don't want anybody to know that you have been hurt so deeply. But again, thanks be to God for those women that I shared with who were professional women, who were women who did not have any education. The one thing they all had, the two things they had in common that I can think of, number one, their color, that they were Black. Number two, their faith. And their faith said all things are possible through Christ Jesus. So we never give up. And so I stayed close to my Christian upbringing. And, the Isaiah, I will mount up wings like an eagle. That became my living testimony when I got knocked down. That's okay. You can knock me down because there's someone inside of me that will help me get back up again. But I took a whole lot on, and I realized that I didn't want anyone to know that someone had hurt me so deeply. And I don't know what it is about pain or rejection or hurt. When someone hurt us, we don't want others. I think this sort of the same scenario happens when a woman is abused at home. You don't tell anybody because you don't want people to know that something like that happened to you. But it's a part of me that lives that would never disappear from me because it helped to make me the person that I am. Out of that story came some strength, some ways of overcoming when people try to destroy you. They don't have that power unless you give it to them. And so that's what, again, came out of that particular experience. But I have always been blessed to appreciate women and to value women because I think we're more in touch with that spirit part of us. And the spirit part of us has a way of making us think we can walk on water sometime. And I know that's dangerous, but it's also in a society that's always putting you down. You got to have something inside of you that's bigger than you and stronger than you. And since that message, I can do all things through Christ Jesus who strengthens me. So that every time we get knocked down, we get back up. Because I've been knocked down more times than people can imagine. I just don't sometimes say it a whole lot because, again, it brings about shame. And I don't think any of us want anyone to know about that shame that we are enduring.
And here's the thing. So, in the kind of therapeutic community, which is, just different names in different spaces, but we talk about transference and countertransference. And the countertransference is when me, the therapist, starts to see these parts of the client that are familiar to me and usually in some kind of triggering way. And I start to sort of put my stuff on that person. And this is a very general explanation, but the transference is when someone sort of says, here, you take my shame.
Yeah.
And they're not literally saying that, but they're screaming.
Right.
And so it's a lot of that baggage is baggage that was never ours. And we've taken it on, not just in your lifetime, but for generations. And when we start to unpack that, it feels really uncomfortable. It feels like, I don't know, like I'm being disloyal to the shame that I'm supposed to have about this thing. And I think the other part here is, and I always tell people, whether you're a Christian or any other religion, there is like, there's so much just practical understanding in the Bible. And so what I think about is like, when we're carrying that shame of someone else, it's like this big, heavy necklace, made of big wood is like weighing us down. And it's not even our necklace. And so the other people that actually have the shame to transfer that onto us, they're walking around thinking that their behavior is okay. And they don't have an opportunity to self-correct because you can't change what you don't see. And so it's like right now in my mind, I'm like looking at those little girls sitting next to you and beautiful you. And I'm looking at them right now and I'm imagining, this woman coming up and saying, no, you don't get to do this. Right. She is your beautiful child of God, no different than you. And you get to take this back. I'll help you carry it because it's yours. But we're going to return this to sender. And so that's the picture I have of that wasn't that person around at that time.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it was a huge school auditorium and everybody saw it. And so it was not just me being hurt and nobody else seeing it, but everybody saw it in silence, followed. So that was it. But again, those are the kinds of things when they integrated the school system and a whole lot of other things. To be perfectly honest, some of the stuff I'm still unpacking as an adult person, because as strong as my mom and all of the Black women were, there were times when we saw their fear. And it was usually around the concern that one of their children could end up being killed if they didn't understand the parameters that they had to stay in. And so my family did a couple of things that caused the women in our community grave concern. One was the same year that the high school was integrated and I went to that school was the year that my sister was the first African American woman to enter into an interracial marriage. And I didn't know how close that was to the Lovins, the movie about the Lovins. Well, I didn't realize that. I think they were in 1962. So I think this was like in 1964, 65, the year that the Civil Rights Bill was signed. So that stirred up a whole lot of stuff. And it was the women who went to bat. Unfortunately, my family was not wanted in the neighborhood. And I didn't understand that, why all of these beautiful Black people were turning against us too. I've just recently understood the full implications of their fear. And that was that the entire community could have been burned down, you know? But we were doing what we thought was our God given right, that we have been taught to be bold and to be courageous, don't walk in fear. That's what you hear in church, right? And so we stood with my sister. But when you have crosses burning on the lawns and threats, it's crazy. So that was a time when I didn't understand this circle of women that was always taking care of the community. It broke down for us for a time and felt like we had to sort of walk alone. I've come full circle on that. And those women, too, once my sister and her husband moved, the neighborhood went back to being an okay neighborhood. But I do believe that sisterhood gives us strength. It gives us another set of lens to see the world through. My time with you and Pastor Karen and hearing all of our different stories and the pain or the things that we've been through in order to be who we are today. Those things didn't crush us. I wish we could have avoided some of them, but they did not crush us. And instead, I think they did give us a kind of strength that now we can stand and proclaim our right to be here with new and stronger voices. And I think we can do it with a gentler spirit, sort of, in some ways, because wisdom has taught us some things. One of the things that, as an older woman now, I weep for young women because it doesn't seem that they have the kind of women mentoring them that was always in my corner. And the burden wasn't on my mother to correct us all the time. The mothers of the church, come here, baby. you know, what your mama told you at home when you got to church, it was reinforcing. So you guys should have listened to my mama. Not all these women on my case. And some of that was good. Some of it, I know not all what happened was good, but you had a community nurturing you, a community of women in particular who thought it was their responsibility to look out for every female child. And God knows I didn't know why that was such an important issue until I got older. And I started hearing the stories of women who had been abused, or women who had been molested as a child and everything. And I remember when I had to go back to my mom and say, I'm sorry, I just didn't understand why you were so protective, why you guarded us so much. And you said one day we would understand it, and I understand it now. And thank you, for loving me enough to make sure, even though this man that you married was my stepfather, and you loved him and he was a good man and everything, he was still male, and you weren't going to take any chances, and you felt it was your responsibility to make sure your daughters had boundaries, and he had boundaries with your daughters, where the limits were to be drawn and everything. So again, this mother who left home with 8 little kids and didn't know how she was going to make it, never ever abandoned her role as being a mother. You know, figured out how I could tell some stories. I'm so glad I didn't live there very long, but the short period of time when I was with my mother, when she left my father, and my mother right now, she taught her daughters one thing. She would say to us, if you let a man beat on you, I will come and get you and beat you myself. It's so serious she was. Do not let a man ever touch you or anything. Do not. She said, because I've taken enough for every last one of you and every woman in the community. And she was serious about it. So, but I'm glad I didn't understand it as a child. I just thought she was being a mean mother. But now I realize she was guarding that which God had entrusted into her hand. And if it meant her life, then she would lay down her life to protect her daughters. And she had this wisdom to see with these eyes that she didn't let her love for my father blind her to the reality that sometimes men will be men. I guess it's the language that they would use in those days. And I would hurt for my stepdad because he was not that kind of person at all. But my mother just knew people, you know. She knew what she had been through, and she was not going to let that pattern of that curse continue to happen.
I want to come back to how so many women in telling our stories had to break silence because
Yes.
there
Yes.
were like your mom appropriately told you all this is what's
Mhm.
happening. And I basically already did this for you, so you don't have to do this. And there are women even today that break the silence, that say the things that
Mhm.
people would rather keep hushed or secret. And then it allows us to be more forthcoming with our experiences, that it wasn't
Yeah.
always so wonderful and great.
Right, right. Yeah. And so again, for me, women, and I'm grateful for the strong presence of Black men in my life. I own that. I know that was important too. But I am really grateful that on every step of this journey, God has placed some strong African American women in my life. Women with wisdom, women with understanding, women with the ability to see, because sometimes we can't always see what's in us. We might have a sense of feeling it, but it's nothing like having an older woman sit you down, or another sister for that matter, sit you down and name something for you that you refuse to see or that you negate exists. And then when you get home and you think about it, you realize how precious it is. I am who I am today largely because I've always been surrounded by strong African American women in particular. And there have been some white sisters that have stood with me, and sisters of other racial ethnic backgrounds as well. But there have been some sisters that nobody can replace them. They've been there. We may not see each other often. We may not socialize a whole lot. But when it comes to the struggle and the transitions and the things that we've been through, I know I would not have made it through some of those things without having that sister walk with me through that. But I tend to go back to the older women. I've always valued their wisdom and their knowledge. I have to tell you this about your mom. I see pictures of her on Facebook all the time, and we sort of share things together. And I remember once when we went to dinner together one night, and we went to this Chinese restaurant in Chicago. And I look at your mom and I wonder sometimes, I say, and I finally figured it out. I said, I could have been her friend as well as her daughter's friend, in terms of age wise, because I have the ability, I could go either way, because I'm close to her in some ways and I'm close to you in some ways. I thought about that the other day and I thought that's really strange when I saw you all on some program you were doing, I think, and she was sharing with you. And so, but again, it's been people like your mom that's a stable when we look at where we've come. And now I identify more, I think, with your mom than I do with you because I'm learning what it means now to be a senior citizen. And I needed some new images for what it means to be an elderly Black woman. And how do you walk into that when your spirit and your mind is just a number? And yeah, there are some things that are happening that make you aware of that, but I don't want to stop living. And so I see your mom and I go, she's more engaged in life than ever. And so again, another witness, God always places someone there. So I think it's important for us to never stop telling our stories. And sometimes telling them is not vocalizing, but making yourself visible for people to see. And so through Facebook, your mom has become this visible image that you don't have to start worrying about life is coming to an end. What you need to do is learn how to live life fully, and I don't see too many women doing that. And so I look at your mom on Facebook and I really appreciate how she has lived every stage of her life. But I can't think of anybody else at this point that I see often that do that better than your mom. So please share that with her.
I will definitely share that. And I have been so blessed because the older women in my family live life until they die, for the most part, for the most part, and have accepted those transitions. Yes, she did. And they've accepted those transitions with grace, not trying to be stuck at another time in their life, but I guess coming into that eldership and being honored and grateful to be there. So I want to ask you one last thing. And if someone is celebrating the way that you told their story 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now, what 2 or 3 things in terms of the message of your story would you want them to pick up?
I'm trying to think what your question is to make sure I understand your question. What 3 things I would want someone to pick up if they heard my story? Okay. Because from the day I think the day I opened my eyes, the day I came into an awareness of who I am, I have always known that there was a power greater in me. And I later came to identify what this awesome power was. And I knew other people saw it, and I knew it sometimes some people didn't know what to think about it. But I would want them to learn the power of their faith. Faith is just, and to listen to that voice because it will, even when I didn't know what it was inside of me, I knew that it was greater than me and that it would protect me and take care of me until I grew into it. So some people may call it intuition, knowing yourself, having a sense of who you are before anybody even plant any seeds. I don't know if that happens to everybody, but for me, I swear the day I came out of the womb, you ain't messing with me because I know who I am. And so have a strong sense of self, purpose, and God. And then I think the other part is surround yourself with genuine, authentic friends. And lastly, don't fear walking down that road that's least traveled or less traveled. Because if you are trying to walk with too many people, you will miss what God has in store for you. So have good friends, enjoy life, but make sure those friends are people that want, and that's not even it. I just think it's, don't get distracted by the crowds. Don't get caught up, you know. Don't be afraid to just choose the road less traveled. That would be it. Choose the road less traveled. Those things have blessed me abundantly. Every decision I make, it's those three things have sort of been there along the way. Have never ever wanted to move too far away from God. Never. I don't know where that came from. I don't know if you can be born with that sense of God's presence, or a sense of, even the sense of, you're going to be somebody, but you can't envision it. You don't know what, but it's in you. And the last thing I would say as I enter into senior citizen age, I haven't become everything that I wanted to be. And that's okay. Because I think if you accomplish everything in this life that you dream or hope or desire, then somehow you're less than human. There should be something left when we leave this world that we didn't get to do. But do as much as you can that brings joy and happiness to yourself and to others. So love yourself. Yeah, so I think I've said enough, but those are the things for me.
Well, I am so appreciative of our time. And I have to say that from the first time I saw you until now, the essence of who you are is the same. And you are elegant in so many ways. And you are so loving and at the same time clear and boundaried. And and just an intelligence that goes not just with the books, but the ability, like you were talking about earlier, to communicate information to all kinds of people in a way that they understand and don't feel left out. And so I love you. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll share this podcast with a friend. Leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts. If you're listening on our website, InsideOutRecovery.com, please leave a comment. Join our Facebook community, The Inside Out Life. You can also follow us on Instagram, Inside Out Conversations. This podcast is edited by the team at the Creative Imposter Studios.